Hi, mystery readers. I'm Alexandra Amor. This is It's a Mystery Podcast, and I'm here today with George Mercer. Hi, George.
Hi, how are you doing, Alexandra?
Very well. How are you today?
Great.
You've got a gorgeous background there. You're in British Columbia as well, aren't you? Like I am.
Yeah, just outside of Sydney on the Saanich Peninsula, so looking out at the stormy southeast winds blowing in on town.
It has been a quite a stormy time, hasn't it, lately on the West Coast?
Yeah, and I was just sort of getting updated on the tsunami or the earthquake last night. So just yeah, I don't think we felt it here, although I think I woke up and walked around the house at exactly when it happened, but I didn't know what woke me.
Oh, wow. Isn't that interesting? Well, I'll tell you what, I got woken by air raid sirens, and we were evacuated to high ground, which is the local high school,
Okay.
at 3 o'clock in the morning,
Oh,
and then they released us at about 4:20, and we were allowed to go back home when the warning was downgraded to an advisory or whatever the next level down is.
wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, and now you're doing this. You're a trooper.
Well, I slept in after that. All right, let me introduce you to our audience without further ado. George Mercer is a former Canadian National Park Warden with over 30 years' experience working in national parks from the East Coast to the West, including the North and the Rocky Mountains. Since retiring in 2012, he has been writing for the first fiction series about Canada's national parks, a mystery suspense with each novel set in a different park, following his characters as they make their way across Canada. George currently has 3 novels published, including the title book Dyed in the Green, which was released in 2014, Wood Buffalo, released in 2016, and Jasper Wild, which was released in the summer of 2017. George is currently working on the 4th book in the series, titled Fat Cats, which he hopes to have out in spring or early summer 2018. So, George, tell me, when you were working for Parks Canada, did you want to write then, or when did the idea to write this series come to you?
Uh, Well, I always sort of played around with writing in that. Most of my work in parks, and that, or most of my writing there was more technical than that. But I was a bit notorious forever. Whenever we went to, ended up at a warden cabin, a patrol cabin, that where a lot of other people would, sign their name and a date. I would often write a small story or a little anecdote about, our trip or whatever. So I always was interested in writing. The Dyed in the Green story was the first novel that I wrote. And I actually wrote it about 15 years ago when we were in Jasper National Park. And I really wrote it because I found that when we went to Cape Breton Highlands, we had such a profound experience there that it was a story that just sort of resonated with me. And I actually whipped off that story in about 3 months of nights while our kids were in bed. And initially I just wrote it, got it out of my system, and I shelved it. I put it in a binder and I shelved it. I did try and get a traditional, I did submit it to some publishers and that, and I didn't get any interest, but every time I would pull that binder out, that story would really resonate with me. And I said, there's at least one story here. And then when I, gave Dyed in the Green as a draft to some readers to have a look at for me, they were all pretty keen on it. And then I sort of thought, well, I'm going to try and turn this into a series, which is now what I've decided to do.
Oh, fantastic. And I noticed in the forwards to one of the books, or the front matter, that you have books planned out until 2020. So Fat Cats is going to be coming out this year, 2018, and then you have several other titles after that. So I'm just, my mind just boggles. How do you know so far in advance what they're going to be about?
Yeah, so I've had a bit of a game plan for a while, and actually what I'm finding now is after I wrote Jasper Wild, the 3rd book, I felt that I had left some unfinished business with that book, and I actually have even inserted a 7th book into the series that I'm probably going to call Malign Unfinished Business. And so yeah, but I've had the plan for at least 6 books for quite a while, and I originally sort of started with, Died, as I told you, was written a long time ago, but Fat Cats was sort of the thing that got me thinking here about getting back into writing, and it's now book 4 in the series. But yeah, I've always had it sort of figured out that my characters were going to go across Canada, hit these different national parks that my wife and I worked in ourselves. So I'm only writing about places that I know about and worked in. But yeah, I always had it sort of figured out that it was going to be a cross Canada trek, and that ultimately the series was going to return to the East Coast, and the very last book is going to end where the first book began.
Oh, nice. What a nice bit of or I guess a full circle moment, as Oprah would say.
Yeah, that's sort of the angle. And I mean, I've got so many other writing ideas in my like all of us, I'm sure. But there is another book that I'm working on called Harking, which is outside of the series. And Harking is about a young girl who tries to save a family of grizzly bears. But totally outside of the Dyed in the Green series. But right now, my focus is the series, and just to try and follow through with all the books that I've got planned.
And do you find that it's easy to keep going? That you're enjoying the series?
Oh yeah, I find it's like right now, Fat Cats is with my editor, who is now a law student at Dalhousie, and while she's editing that one, I'm now probably I'm getting right back into Harking, and I'm also thinking lots about this fifth book idea that I had about Malene, Unfinished Business. And I often actually, as because it is a series, there's oftentimes I will get ideas as I'm going along writing one book about something that I need to incorporate in a subsequent book. So there is an African ranger that comes into the into the Jasper story, who will play a big part in book 6 or 7 called The Rhino's Horn. And so I'm always sort of adding pieces in just to remind myself that I need to incorporate these characters and make the links back to the series.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love hearing that. And when I started learning more about your books, I was reminded of Nevada Barr's series in the American national parks, which you must get comparisons to that all the time. And also Paul Dwaran's character, who is a main, I think he's a game warden.
Yeah, he's a game warden. Yeah, both of those. I won't profess to be as good a writer as either Nevada Barr or Paul Dwaran, but part of the reason why I'm writing my series, and I think Paul hits the nail on the head quite a bit. The only thing I found with Nevada Barr's writing is I found that her stories, I call them blood and guts murder mysteries in U.S. parks. And while I appreciate that it's plausible, potentially, especially in a U.S. park maybe, I didn't see those as being the types of stories that really resonate with me for the realities of what we faced as park wardens in Canadian national parks. And even though Dyed in the Green is actually a bit of a murder mystery, that's not the intent for my series. My intent is really to certainly try and match the quality probably of writing of Nevada Barr and Paul, but to tell stories that I think are more plausible and dealt with the experiences we had with a bit of a fictional twist to them for sure, to try and ramp up the suspense and the mystery.
Well, that's a great segue actually into my next question. So, when you were thinking of Dyed in the Wool, was it based on an experience or an event or something that you encountered yourself when you were a park warden?
Yeah. So, excuse me, as I was saying before, so Dyed in the Green really was first the expression. It was provided by a friend, a fellow Newfoundlander, actually, when we worked in Wood Buffalo National Park. We were talking about people's commitment to parks and protected areas and people who work as rangers around the world and that. And my friend made the comment that an older chief warden out east had used the expression dyed in the green, so that unlike being dyed in the wool, or similar to being dyed in the wool, I guess, but in the sense that people who are passionate about parks and protected areas are not dyed in the wool, they're dyed in the green. And, excuse me, so yeah, the Cape Breton story was really, it was really an eye-opener for me. When we went to Cape Breton Highlands is an amazing park in the Maritime Provinces, one of the larger parks in Atlantic Canada. And right away, though, we were inundated with poachings. It was almost like a nightly event that we would be out staking out part of the park for either a salmon poacher in the summer or a deer poacher in the fall and winter. And it was so profound. Some of the people that we dealt with were just notorious, and yet within the community they were almost accepted. They'd never really been caught before, and people didn't really have an appreciation for how much poaching these people were doing and how devastating that their poaching could be to the national park. And I think when we first caught some of these guys and demonstrated to people that, for one, they could be caught and they were having a major impact on the park, I think we really helped change the community's attitudes about us and the acceptance of poaching. And it was, although at the same time I was told when we moved, it was almost like the night after we left. There were poachers back on the go full time. But yeah, it was really sort of that juxtaposition of, on the one hand, poaching and the impact that it was having in the park, and the acceptance of poaching within the community. And the local community they were supporters of the park. I think they just didn't have an appreciation for how much of an impact that poaching, which they also accepted, was having. And I think that started to change when they saw what we were up against and some of the successes that we had.
And I imagine that then carrying on from that, so you had this experience yourself with poaching and Died in the Green came out quite easily. And then were you able to tap into other stories that you had encountered or events to continue on?
Yeah, so you know what? In every single park that we've worked in, the parks all face these unique challenges. And when we landed in Wood Buffalo National Park, as an example, there was an actual plan back in the 80s to slaughter all of the bison in Wood Buffalo National Park because of disease issues, but it was really sort of a blown up issue by Agriculture Canada and Alberta Agriculture, who were pushing agriculture and ranching closer and closer into to Wood Buffalo through the boreal forest. Anyway, that sort of story is, I throw in a bit of a twist with an elder in the community who could be influential about stopping this proposed slaughter, being kidnapped. And so I throw in a twist in the Wood Buffalo story to add sort of mystery and suspense to it. But yeah, every single park faces its unique challenges. And that's the other thing where my series, I think, is different from some of the stuff, for instance, that Nevada Barr has written. And like I say, she's a phenomenal writer. But what I wanted to do was really profile, in a fictional way, profile some of the challenges faced by our national parks in Canada and give people an idea about the challenges that people who work for our national parks, and not just park wardens, but everyone who works for national parks, and a lot of people actually outside of parks who are just committed people in the communities who support parks, just to talk about some of the challenges that these places face. But to do it using fiction and to try and attract readers who might not otherwise read a story about our national parks, might not read a nonfiction story about the proposed bison slaughter, or might not read a technical paper about poaching and the impacts of poaching. I just wanted to do it with a fictional twist to try and get people who might otherwise sort of slip through the cracks.
What a fantastic idea. I love this so much. And I imagine too that, I mean, you worked in the parks for over 30 years. And so it's something you're obviously very passionate about. And I'm imagining that writing these books then enables you to kind of keep your hand in a way, and to continue to serve this amazing natural treasure that we have in Canada.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly it. I mean, in retirement, I sort of didn't think that I would be writing fiction, but to be honest with you, I took a couple fiction writing courses at Camosun College in UVic, and the instructor was very encouraging, and saw a little bit of the writing in Died in the Green and some of the other pieces I'd written, and then the idea of just using it. Plus, when I retired, actually in 2012, I literally retired the day before the federal government did massive cuts to parks. So I wasn't in a great mood about writing nonfiction. I just found that, and when people would ask me, why are you writing fiction? I would say I'm actually writing fiction because I can't handle the realities that were going on. I was just, so it is a way to continue. It is a way to keep my hand in it. And it's also a way to pass on, the stories that, we've experienced over 3 decades, and to also try and describe some of these. I get a lot of people telling me, I felt like I was on the Cabot Trail. I felt like I was in the Peace Athabasca Delta. And that actually means more to me than anything, that people are able to get the feeling that of what these parks and these very special places are actually like.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you've mentioned your wife, and so she was she working for the parks as well at the same
Yeah,
time?
Jan and I were both park wardens, and we both sort of worked our way through the system. In the end, I retired as the monitoring ecologist for Gulf Islands National Park, and Jan's planning to retire in the spring. She still works on the environmental side of things in national parks. Um, yeah, so that's the other thing about our outfit. We often live, even though we live in some of the most iconic, beautiful places in Canada, it's often small, remote communities that we end up in. And it's very common within park circles that you end up with someone else from parks. We know a lot of parks couples, not only here in Canada, but like around the world. I think that's sort of a phenomenon of working in this type of an outfit.
Yes, yeah, lucky you. And I imagine you got to live in and experience many areas of Canada that Canadians themselves don't get to experience.
Yeah, I mean that's. I think we've lived and worked in about 7 national parks, and we've visited probably half the national parks in Canada. But I always think my epitaph or whatever on gravestone would be, I want to come back and if there is such a thing as reincarnation, come back and do the parks that we never did the first time around.
Yes, yeah, great idea. Well, and there's a number of them. I was doing a bit of research before this call, and there's a total of 47, except they're divided into 39 parks and 8
Marine.
national reserves or yeah.
Well, so yeah, there are the system's sort of broken into or separated by, well, there are terrestrial national parks, and some of them are reserves or given the name reserve, like Gulf Islands National Park Reserve, and that title is added on until any pending land claims and that in the areas are resolved. So when those are resolved, they become oftentimes what happens, they become full-fledged national parks without that reserve sort of title added to it. But also they become places where First Nations in the community or in those areas also have it's not necessarily a co-management role, but it's pretty much a co-management role. I'm not sure what it's formally called anymore, but they have a pretty major role, and in some cases, a more significant role than anyone else in the management of the park. And then, of course, there are also national marine conservation areas, which Canada is really lagging behind internationally. Like, we don't have a lot of marine protected areas. I know the current government is making a push to try and create them, but for instance, right here in the southern Strait of Georgia, there is a planned national marine conservation area, which would take sort of Gulf Islands National Park would be a core area within it, but then it would capture all of the those portions of the Salish Sea, Harrow Strait, and Georgia Strait, the Strait of Georgia, that would then encompass one larger marine protected area where species like orca would have a greater level of protection than they probably currently do now.
Mm.
So yeah,
Wow.
there's a lot of places, and if I could write about every national park, I'd have to live to be like 150.
Yes, yeah. Well, you're not going to get bored anyway in your retirement, that's for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I was reading, you've got the prologue and the first chapter to Fat Cats up on your website,
yeah.
and I'll link to that in the show notes at it'samysterypodcast.com so that people can read it.
Okay.
And I loved that the prologue, sort of the protagonist, if I can put it that way, of the prologue is a cougar, a mountain lion, and she's there in the Southern Gulf Islands National Park, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, fat cats. Actually, it's interesting. Before I retired, I was very lucky in my last several years with parks, where I got to hire students to help me with the ecological monitoring program, and I had I'll say three kick-ass students of different ages and that, and from different parts of Canada that actually worked with me. And we had so much fun, and I was so inspired by these students that, just sort of like a breath of fresh air coming into the outfit. And you realize, that the passion for parks and protected areas, wilderness and wild spaces is not unique to any one generation. And it was neat to see these younger people coming along. But I would often joke, they'd say, what are you going to do when you retire? And I'd say, well, because the islands are inundated with deer but have no predators, people shoot every cougar or black bear or wolf that shows up. I said, I'm going to have a cougar in my dog carrier, in our dog crate, and I'm going to travel around between the islands in my own boat, and I'm going to put the cat out on the islands, and I'll have a GPS collar on it. So put it out in the winter when there's no one around, and a GPS collar on it, go and grab it again in the spring. And I happened to meet one of the provincial cougar trackers during my work, and I used to joke with him, I mean, it sounds funny, but I actually think it's a very plausible idea. And I used to say to Jerry, would you give me cats that, a cougar shows up in Victoria, instead of destroying it, let me have it for a few months. And I still think it has merit.
Sounds like a good idea to me. And we should explain, that on the Southern Gulf Islands, there are these tiny species of, my parents used to live on Pender, and they refer to them as island deer.
Yeah.
And they're little. There are no natural predators on the Gulf Islands for the most part. No bears, no cougars, no wolves or anything like that. And they do kind of run the place. My parents used to visit a bed and breakfast before they bought their place on Pender Island. And the family there had named a mother deer who came around the house all the time and brought her babies in the spring and that kind of thing. And so, I really could relate to chapter 1 in your book with the fellow who's tracking the cougar. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And it's interesting because Sydney Island, which is just across the water here from town, when I arrived here, I was doing monitoring to try and get an idea of how many deer were on the island. It's all European fallow deer. They were introduced to the island. They're non-native. And they've basically dominated the black-tailed deer. There's almost no blacktail in it. And we were trying to figure out how many European fallow deer there were. And we came to the conclusion that there was somewhere in the order of 3,000 deer on the island, an island that's only 10 square kilometers.
Oh.
I was working on some population modeling and talking to a British nature park and Dr. So-and-so, I can't remember her name there, but anyway, when I told her the numbers, she was blown away. She said, that is totally off the charts. And interestingly enough, as I got into writing Fat Cats this summer, a cougar showed up on Sydney Island.
Oh.
And it's an island that's owned 20% by the national park and about 80% by private landowners. And the landowners ended up taking a vote, and they voted to have the cougar killed. But interestingly, the cougar survived. It wasn't captured for months and months. It just did its thing on the island. And people, it didn't bother anyone, but it took out a lot of deer and a lot of geese, which are also have overpopulated many of the islands here. And unfortunately, then it was caught and shot in the fall. But it was sort of, and I spoke to some of the owners over there, and they said they were just absolutely disgusted that this cougar had been destroyed. So, there is this polarized issue of having a cougar on the landscape. And it's sort of crazy because I also had a young student from Pacific Rim National Park work with me, and she did her master's on cougars. And she said, people always talk about the risk of having a cougar on an island or wherever. But she used the analogy of, but they don't mind driving down the highway at 100 kilometers an hour, separated by a strip of yellow paint, from oncoming traffic. And it's just our perception of risk is sometimes very odd. And that's part of the thing that I want to do in Fat Cats, is just to show how a species like a cougar, any predator, has an important role to play in an ecosystem, and on the islands here in particular. And that's part of the frustration for my main character, is a cougar shows up and ends up being destroyed, but then he sets about to put cougars on the island on his own. So it's going to be living my fantasy.
Yeah, that's right. Well, if you can't do it yourself, you might as well write about somebody who can do it, I suppose. So I just want to ask 2 more quick questions before we go. So Ben Matthews, he's the park warden that you write about. Tell us a little bit about Ben and his background.
Well, so Ben, actually, so there's 2 main characters that I start with, and Ben Matthews and Kate Jones are partners, originally from the East Coast. Ben is sort of this young, rambunctious, rammy park warden who tends not to take no for an answer. And Kate Jones is his partner, but she's much more grounded, and she's often the person that sort of grabs him and brings him back to reality. And really, the series starts out with them, traveling across the country and experiencing these different challenges in different parks, and trying to fight for the protection of these wild places and wild spaces. And they will basically permeate the whole series, although in Fat Cats I do have a character by the name of John Halfcut who shows up in the Jasper story, in Jasper Wild, ends up at the end of that story being transferred to the Gulf Islands, and then he becomes sort of the main character in the Gulf Islands story. And then after that, we'll see some more of Kate Jones. And Ben went to Africa as part of an African exchange program after the Jasper story. So that's the link into my the Rhino's Horn, which is really, I wanted to incorporate one story that talked about brought an international element and talked about sort of the poaching of rhinos and elephants internationally. And so to give this Canadian series, a sense of sort of an international component, an international element, and the sense that, the issues that we face in Canada, in many ways, actually, the issues we face pale in comparison to what rangers face in protected areas in other parts of the planet. But and who knows, that whole African angle may take off. We'll see.
Oh, well, I can't wait to see what happens with that. Yeah, that sounds fascinating as well. So one final comment, I guess it's not exactly a question, but the cover designs for this series are just spectacular, and Wood Buffalo especially, I think, is absolutely gorgeous. Do you want to give a little shout out to your cover designer?
Yeah, so my cover designer is the only thing that's not Canadian about my series. Is my cover designer is a fellow by the name of Dan Stiles in Portland, Oregon. And how I ended up connecting with Dan, it's interesting. I won a little fiction prize here on the peninsula, and I was in at Tanner's Books to collect my prize. And the book, The Sisters Brothers, it always caught my eye. The cover of that story and of that book. And anyway, I asked the lady who runs the fiction section, Ula, at Tanner's, did this cover do anything for the book? And she said, oh, it totally sold the book. Like, it's such a good cover. And so I literally opened up the inside flap and saw the name, and I emailed Dan in Portland, and I said, Patrick DeWitt, wrote The Sisters Brothers and, is an award-winning Canadian author. I'm not. I'm a no-name Canadian author. But I said, I love your covers, and I wonder, would you do them for me from my series that I'm talking about doing? And within, a few minutes, I got this reply saying, absolutely. So I've had to work through his agent in New York, which I thought, okay, that's going to be interesting because we're probably talking, a different price range than I was thinking. But anyway, both his agent in New York and Dan have been phenomenal, and Dan's covers are amazing. And I should have been doing it before, but I'm too cheap. But this year I did submit his covers to independent publishers awards, and I'm almost going to put money on the table that Dan's covers will top out in those awards because they're phenomenal covers.
I totally agree. Yeah, I'd have money on that bet. They're just absolutely amazing. So I'll be featuring the books throughout the show notes of this episode, and so people will be able to see what we're talking about. Yeah, just gorgeous.
Well, I always say to them that my challenge is to write a story as good as the cover that pulls it together.
Well, this has been amazing, George. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. So why don't you let our listeners know where they can find out more about you and your books?
Hey, thanks, Alexandra. So my books are actually available at independent bookstores right from here to Whitehorse to St. John's, Newfoundland. They're across Canada at a lot of independent stores. They're also available now at about 70 Indigo stores across the country. And also on Amazon and Indigo, Kobo websites. And if you want to check out my writing and see some of the prologue and first chapters of the books in the series, of the ones that I've written, and as well as Fat Cats, go to georgemercer.com for that. I haven't done a lot since I retired, but my initial plan was writenature.com. My initial plan was to write about nature, and that was sort of a separate website. But so georgemercer.com and writenature.com. I'm on Facebook under my name, and I'm at Twitter at eGeorgeMercer.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'll put links to all of that in the show notes, as I said.
Hey, thanks so much. It's been great.
Oh, it's been fantastic. Thanks, George. And since we're both on Vancouver Island, we'll have to get together for a cup of coffee one day.
We will do that. Thanks so much, Alexandra.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.
Hey, bye.